The sound of shattering crystal against a white marble floor is distinct, because it doesn't happen in a chaotic room. It happens in an absolute, suffocating silence. At exactly 7:42 p.m., the grand ballroom of the Whispering Pines Country Club went so quiet that the only audible sound left was the rhythmic, low hum of the massive industrial air conditioning units hidden behind the velvet drapes. 200 pairs of eyes, all belonging to the old money elite of Greenwich, Connecticut, froze mid-breath. Champagne flutes remained suspended halfway to manicured lips. My mother, Beatrice Vance, stood near the head table, her face frozen in a grotesque mask of half-finished laughter. Beside her, Victoria Sterling, the matriarch of the billion-dollar defense logistics empire my sister was marrying into, had her fingers wrapped so tightly around her diamond tennis bracelet that her knuckles turned a stark, bloodless white. Between them on the floor lay the fragments of a vintage Baccarat wine glass, the dark red liquid spreading across the pristine Carrara marble like an unpolished stain. I sat at the very edge of the room, perched on a folding metal chair normally reserved for the kitchen staff, right next to the swinging double doors that smelled of roasted garlic and dishwashing chemicals. I didn't blink. I didn't shift my weight. My lower back, worn down by 24 years of military service and a hard helicopter landing in Ramstein over a decade ago, throbbed with a dull, familiar ache. But my posture remained perfectly straight. I looked at the silver crystal ice bucket in the center of the VIP table. Submerged beneath 3 inches of rapidly dissolving cubes lay my gold intelligence badge, the heavy, eagle-crested emblem of a senior counter-corporate espionage officer. My mother had ripped it from my chest less than 10 minutes earlier to ensure I wouldn't embarrass the family lineage in front of their new billionaire investors. As the ice slowly melted, the sharp, uncompromising edges of the military metal began to surface, cutting through the floating translucent cubes. It sat there, cold and unyielding, while the expensive bubbles of their celebratory champagne slowly went flat beside it. But before I tell you why the most powerful defense contractor in New England was currently staring at that ice bucket with his jaw completely slack, and why a man who controlled billions was trembling at the formal crest of a plain soldier, hit that like button and subscribe to this channel. Because what happened next, no one in that elegant room saw coming. Let me take you back to how this weekend actually started. My name is Eleanor Vance. I am 52 years old. If you saw me walking down the streets of Annapolis or sitting in the corner of a quiet diner in Maryland, you wouldn't look twice. I wear faded gray blazers from outlet stores, drive a 2014 Toyota Camry with a cracked front bumper from an old parking lot mishap, and live in a 1-bedroom apartment where the most expensive piece of furniture is a wooden bookshelf holding histories of 20th century logistics. For the last 20 years, my family believed I was a glorified paper pusher, a low-level administrative clerk who had ruined her youth by joining the army because she couldn't cut it in the elite private equity circles of New York. My mother often told her friends that I managed files at a desk somewhere in Maryland. I let them believe it. I never corrected that assumption. In my line of work, anonymity isn't just a professional preference. It is a tactical necessity. When you spend your life auditing the classified supply chains of multi-billion-dollar defense corporations to ensure foreign intelligence services haven't bought their way into Pentagon networks, you learn very quickly that the most dangerous person in the room is always the one everyone ignores. The military doesn't teach you to shout. It teaches you to observe. It teaches you that when people believe you have nothing to offer, they stop hiding who they truly are. They leave their books open. They talk too loudly near the water coolers. They reveal their greed because they assume a middle-aged woman in a plain uniform lacks the teeth to bite. So, when my sister, Meredith, announced her engagement to Julian Sterling, the sole heir to Sterling Global Logistics, I knew exactly what kind of room I was walking into. I bought a coach ticket, packed my single garment bag containing my Class A dress uniform, and prepared myself for 3 days of elegant misery. I didn't go because I craved their validation. I went because even after decades of cold silence, a small, stubborn part of your mind always wonders if blood recognizes blood when the theater stops. The contempt wasn't a sudden development. It was an architecture built over 35 years. My mother, Beatrice, had spent her entire adult life running from the one thing she feared more than death: the appearance of mediocrity. My father had passed away when I was 12, leaving behind a modest insurance policy and a family name that carried social weight but lacked the liquid capital to sustain it. From that day on, my mother treated our family like a business listing that needed constant window dressing. Meredith was her masterpiece. Blonde, pliable, and perfectly attuned to the subtle shifts of high society expectations. When Meredith married well, Beatrice won, but I was the defect in the ledger. The pattern established itself early. When I earned a scholarship to West Point, my mother didn't attend the ceremony. She told her bridge club I had gone to a state school with strict rules because she couldn't bear the thought of admitting her oldest daughter was wearing combat boots instead of cashmere. I remember coming home for Thanksgiving in 2012. I had just spent 9 months in an underground bunker outside Stuttgart, tracking illicit microchip transfers to hostile entities. I was exhausted. My skin was sallow from lack of sunlight, and my back pain was so severe I could barely lift my luggage. My mother didn't ask about my health. She looked at the small, silver commendation pin on my civilian lapel and smiled that thin, practiced smile she used for unpromising retail workers. "It's cute that they give you those little trinkets, Eleanor," she had whispered over the turkey. "But could you leave it in the drawer while the neighbors are here? Richard's son just made partner at Goldman Sachs, and we really don't need to remind everyone that you're still working for a government salary." I didn't argue. I put the pin in the drawer. I let them believe it. By the time I arrived at the Greenwich estate for the wedding rehearsal dinner, the illusion had reached its absolute zenith. The Sterlings were not just rich. They were untouchable. They owned 3 separate shipping yards, held hundreds of millions of dollars in federal logistics contracts, and moved through the world with the absolute confidence of people who bought legislation by the metric ton. While they laughed over cocktails, I kept a silent secondary ledger running in my head. They saw an empire. I saw a perimeter breach. I already knew what their balance sheets hid: 3 primary logistics yards, 142 localized transshipment ventures, and exactly 74 separate cybersecurity non-compliance warnings completely ignored over the span of 11 months. They thought they were building a dynasty. I knew they were building an evidence locker. When I walked into the sunroom of the country club on Friday afternoon, the air smelled of imported lilies and white truffles. Victoria Sterling was sitting on a cream silk sofa, reviewing the seating arrangements with my mother like 2 generals planning a siege on a small country. My mother spotted me first. Her eyes immediately dropped to my feet, then moved up my plain navy slacks to my utilitarian black winter coat. A look of genuine physical discomfort passed over her face. I stood near the entrance, watching my old Toyota Camry sitting in the gravel lot outside through the paned windows. It looked entirely out of place next to the lines of pristine, black German sedans, but I knew its steel. I knew its reliability. It didn't need a polished veneer to operate under pressure. "Eleanor," my mother said, her voice dropping into that frantic, hushed register she reserved for emergencies. "You're late. And why are you carrying that heavy garment bag into the main room? The staff entrance is around the back." "The front door was closer, Mother," I said, setting my bag down carefully. My lower back flared with pain from the 3-hour drive. "Good to see you, Meredith." My sister offered her cheek for a dry kiss, her eyes tracking the scuff marks on my leather shoes. "You didn't bring that uniform, did you, Eleanor? Julian's family has some very high-level guests coming tonight. The CEO of Vanguard Systems is flying in on a private jet. We really wanted the aesthetic to be classic corporate elegance, not institutional." Victoria Sterling looked up from her tablet, her gaze cold and assessing. She didn't rise. She merely tilted her head. "A uniform? In the ballroom? Oh, Beatrice, dear. I thought you said your oldest daughter worked in office management. We have the state senator arriving at 8. A military uniform looks so aggressive during a family dinner, don't you think? It shifts the focus. My mother flushed crimson. She stood up quickly, her silk dress rustling. Of course, Victoria. I've already taken care of it. Eleanor will be wearing a lovely silk wrap I bought for her. She won't be in the photographs. I stood there, my hand resting on the zipper of the garment bag that held my Class A jacket. The jacket that bore the silver oak leaves of a colonel and the crest of Fort Meade. I looked at my mother's terrified, desperate face. I looked at Victoria Sterling's dismissive, aristocratic smirk. I understand completely, I said softly. I let them believe it. The rain began at 6 p.m. on Saturday evening, a cold, gray downpour that turned the manicured lawns of the country club into sodden trenches. Inside the grand ballroom, however, the weather was merely background music to the display of absolute wealth. The room was a sea of black tuxedos and designer gowns. The centerpiece of the evening was a massive ice sculpture of a soaring Hawksey, the corporate logo of Sterling Global Logistics. Waiters in white gloves glided between tables, pouring $1,000 magnums of vintage champagne. I had arrived early, as training dictates, but when I reached the entrance, my mother was waiting for me in the foyer. Her hands were trembling as she looked at my dress uniform. The gold buttons gleamed under the chandeliers. The sharp, dark blue fabric of the jacket was immaculate. On my left breastplate sat my intelligence badge, its heavy gold wings catching the light. "What are you doing?" she hissed, grabbing my forearm. Her nails dug into my skin through my sleeve. "I told you not to wear this." Victoria is already furious. Arthur Pendleton just arrived. The man who controls the entire multi-billion-dollar Vanguard merger. If he sees you walking around looking like an active-duty recruiter, he's going to think this family lacks class. "This is my formal attire, Mother," I said, my voice dropping into that steady, unyielding frequency I use during federal interrogations. "It is legally authorized for all formal events." "I don't care about your rules," she whispered fiercely. "You are ruining this for your sister. Look at yourself. You look stiff. You look old. You look like you belong at a security gate, not a VIP table." She dragged me into the small anteroom off the main hall where the extra linens were stored. Before I could move, her hand shot forward with an efficiency born of pure panic. She didn't just ask me to remove the jacket. She grabbed the edge of my gold intelligence badge and yanked it upward. The fabric tore slightly. The heavy gold metal pins clicked sharply against her large diamond ring, before the entire badge came loose in her hand. "You are sitting at table 14, she said, her breathing ragged as she tucked my badge into her small satin evening bag. "Near the kitchen. I told Victoria you had a severe headache and preferred to stay near the exit. If you come up to the head table, I will personally tell the security guards you are trespassing. Do you understand me, Eleanor? This family has waited 15 years for this kind of leverage. I will not let your petty ego destroy it." I looked down at the empty space on my uniform, where my credential had sat for 15 years. I felt the cold air from the hallway seep through the small tear in the fabric. Training took over. Not anger, not revenge. Training. When a network is breached, you do not scream at the hacker. You do not show your hand. You watch the anomaly move through the system until it hits the final perimeter. You let them believe they have successfully bypassed your security, because that is the exact moment they become sloppy. I walked out of the linen room, my posture unchanged. I didn't head to table 14. Instead, I walked down the quiet service corridor behind the ballroom, pulled out my government-issued encrypted phone, a matte black device with no markings, and dialed a secure direct line to the Regional Oversight Office at Fort Meade. The phone rang exactly half a times before a crisp, dry voice answered. "Oversight, state your clearance code." "Viper 7 Alpha," I said evenly. "This is Colonel Vance. I am currently on site at the Whispering Pines Country Club in Greenwich. The target entity, Sterling Global Logistics, is currently finalizing their merger with Vanguard Systems tonight. I need an immediate status update on the federal compliance audit for Project Steel Shield." A brief, 3-second silence followed as the terminal across the state processed my biometrics through the secure relay. Then, the voice returned, colder than before. "Colonel, the audit was finalized 48 hours ago. Sterling Logistics failed on 3 separate counts of unauthorized foreign asset integration. Their federal defense transport licenses were officially suspended at 4:30 p.m. today. The debarment paperwork is signed. Vanguard Systems was notified via secure terminal 60 minutes ago." I looked through the small glass pane of the service door. Across the crowded ballroom, I could see Victoria Sterling laughing, her arm looped through my mother's as they raised their glasses to Arthur Pendleton, the CEO of Vanguard. They thought they were celebrating a billion-dollar union. They had no idea they were celebrating a corpse. "Is the field team in position?" I asked. 2 minutes out, Colonel. They have the federal warrants. Federal marshals and CID investigators are executing the asset freeze. General Vance signed the containment order himself. "Understood," I said. "I am maintaining observation from within the perimeter." I hung up. I slipped the phone into my pocket. My back was screaming from the tension, but I walked back into the ballroom with the slow, measured steps of a person who has already seen the end of the film. I took my seat at table 14. It was a drafty, round table situated right beneath the primary air conditioning vent, directly adjacent to the kitchen doors. Every time a waiter kicked the doors open, the smell of grease and wet wool from the rain outside washed over me. My mother had returned to her seat at the head table. I watched her reach into her satin bag, pull out my gold intelligence badge with a look of utter disgust, and drop it carelessly into the large silver crystal ice bucket holding the Magnum Cabernet. It hit the metal with a sharp, heavy clink, a sound completely ignored by the laughing millionaires surrounding her. The room was filled with a massive wall of noise. My mother and Victoria Sterling were speaking loudly, their voices carrying over the clinking silverware, as they threw around heavy words like dynasty, billion-dollar infrastructure, and generational legacy. They performed their dominance over the room with practiced, booming laughter, entirely drowning out the sound of the rain outside. In stark contrast, I sat perfectly still at table 14. I kept my breathing measured, practicing the rhythmic 4-4 tactical breath control, taught to intelligence officers under duress. I didn't engage, I didn't speak, and I didn't make a sound. I simply let the silence expand from my corner of the room. "To the future," Victoria Sterling announced loudly, her voice amplified by the ballroom's sound system as she stood up to toast her guests. "To a partnership that will secure our family's legacy for the next 3 generations. And to our guest of honor, Arthur Pendleton, who recognized that true success requires the right lineage." The room erupted into polite, wealthy applause. Arthur Pendleton, a tall, imposing man of 65 with stone-gray hair and the cold, unyielding eyes of a veteran Washington insider, stood up from his seat. He picked up his glass, ready to return the gesture. But as he leaned forward, his eyes happened to drift down to the ice bucket in front of Beatrice Vance. The light from the crystal chandelier caught the wet, gold wings of the badge submerged beneath the melting ice. As the ice dissolved, the stark, vertical dagger and the 3 lightning bolts of the Joint Intelligence Task Force emerged completely, gleaming with an aggressive, cold authority that shattered the room's elegant presentation. Arthur Pendleton froze. The glass of vintage wine slipped from his fingers. It didn't just tip over. It dropped vertically, striking the edge of the marble table, before shattering onto the floor below. The sound of the breaking glass cut through the room like a rifle shot. The applause died instantly. The noise wall vanished. The frantic laughter of my family was completely swallowed by an absolute, freezing stillness. All I could hear was the low, rhythmic hum of the massive industrial air conditioning units 30 feet above. My mother laughed nervously, her voice cracking under the sudden drop in temperature. "Oh, Arthur dear. Don't worry about that. The staff will clean it up immediately. It's just an old piece of military tin my daughter left lying around. I put it in there to keep it out of the sight lines. It's so gaudy." Pendleton didn't look at her, He didn't look at Victoria Sterling. His face had gone from a healthy, wealthy flush to a terrifying, pale gray. His eyes zoomed in on that ice bucket, then slowly, frame by frame. His gaze scanned the entire perimeter of the room. He passed the VIP tables, past the state senator, past the ice sculpture of the hawk, until his eyes locked onto table 14. Onto me, the multi-billion-dollar contractor, the man who answered only to congressional subcommittees and cabinet secretaries, pushed his chair back with a harsh scraping sound that made everyone flinch. He didn't walk. He marched down the center aisle of the ballroom, ignoring Victoria Sterling's frantic questions. He stopped exactly 3 feet from my folding chair, his spine snapping into a rigid, military salute that looked entirely out of place in a room full of silk and tuxedos. "Viper," he whispered, his voice shaking just enough for the surrounding tables to hear. "Tell me your team isn't here for Project Steel Shield." I didn't stand up. I didn't lift a glass. I sat on my metal chair, looked at the man who had tried to buy his way around federal security laws, and gave him a cold, 5-word response. "You should have checked the credentials, Arthur." Behind him, my mother's mouth opened, but no sound came out. She looked at the 4-star executive saluting her paper-pusher daughter, and her entire understanding of reality began to fracture. Victoria Sterling's hands began to shake so violently, she dropped her silver dessert fork onto her plate with a hollow clatter. The front doors of the country club didn't just open, they were bypassed. 6 federal marshals in dark windbreakers, accompanied by 3 active-duty CID investigators in sharp gray suits, entered the ballroom with the quiet, mechanical speed of a raid. They didn't shout. They didn't draw weapons. They walked directly to the head table, presented a set of sealed blue federal folders to Julian Sterling and his father, and began the systematic process of asset containment. The brunch guests, the old money neighbors, the state senator, they didn't stay to offer support. They scrambled for the coat checks like rats fleeing a flooding basement. Within 12 minutes, the grand ballroom was an empty cavern of abandoned champagne and melting ice. The collapse didn't arrive with emotional speeches. It arrived in the cold, unyielding precision of metrics. The $1.2 billion merger contract was frozen in exactly 180 seconds. Before the New York Stock Exchange would open on Monday morning, Sterling Global Logistics stock value would plummet by 42%. My mother's emergency bridge loan of $18 million, leveraged entirely against Meredith's impending marriage, was suddenly stripped of all legal collateral. My mother stood alone in the center of the ruins, her satin bag clutched to her chest like a useless shield. Her high society friends had left without even saying goodbye. Her daughter Meredith was sobbing in the corner, her expensive wedding dress trailing through the spilled wine on the floor. I walked up to the head table, reached into the crystal ice bucket, and pulled my gold intelligence badge out of the freezing water. The metal was ice cold against my palm, but it felt solid, familiar, real. Beatrice looked at me, her eyes wild, her face older than her 55 years. "Eleanor, what did you do? Talk to him. Talk to that man. Tell them this is a family event. You have a position. You have a rank. Fix this. For your sister's sake. For my sake." I pulled a linen napkin from the table, and slowly, methodically wiped the water from the gold wings of my badge. "You told me to hide my uniform, Mother," I said softly, my voice devoid of anger, filled only with that quiet, retrospective certainty. "You told me it lacked class." "I didn't know," she cried, her voice echoing off the empty walls. "I thought you were just a clerk. Why didn't you tell me who you were?" I pinned the badge back onto my wet uniform jacket, the steel pins sliding into place with a definitive click. "I wanted to know how you treated someone you believed had nothing left to offer," I said. "And now you know what that costs." I turned away before she could reply. I didn't wait for her tears. I didn't stay to watch her explain to the Greenwich Country Club why her family name was about to be listed on the Federal Debarment Registry. At 2:10 a.m., the rain had finally cleared, leaving the highway between Greenwich and Fort Meade dark, clean, and empty. I pulled my Camry into the gravel driveway of a small, 24-hour diner outside Baltimore. Outside, a fleet of dark government transport vans rolled past the interstate, their heavy tires kicking up the remaining rainwater. Next to them, my scratched, worn Camry sat quietly in the dark lot, completely invisible to the world. I walked inside, sat at a worn laminate booth near the window, and ordered a $3 cup of black coffee from a waitress who didn't know my name and didn't care about my rank. I took my gold intelligence badge out of my pocket and placed it carefully on the laminate table, right beside a deep, old scratch in the wood. At the beginning of this weekend, this badge had been snatched away, treated as an embarrassing piece of cheap junk that threatened to stain an elegant room. Now, it rested under the harsh glare of the diner's fluorescent lights. Unpolished, scratched, yet radiating the quiet, absolute weight of an object that had just systematically dismantled a multi-billion-dollar facade. I was entirely alone, but as I took a sip of the bitter, hot coffee, I felt an absolute, unshakable peace settle into my chest. Not because my mother was ruined, not because my sister's high society merger had turned into a federal investigation, but because I had finally stopped trying to explain my value to people who were emotionally committed to ignoring it. The world outside had been completely upended, but inside this quiet booth, the truth had finally cleared the ledger. A lot of women who listen to this story will think the most important moment was when the glass shattered, or when the CEO saluted me in front of the people who had banished me to the kitchen. It wasn't. The hardest part of living a life of quiet honor isn't the deployment or the physical pain, or the long hours spent in windowless rooms protecting a nation that doesn't know your name. The hardest part is sitting at a table with your own blood and realizing that they only measure your worth by the labels they can show their friends. Many families have a golden child, someone whose superficial achievements are celebrated like corporate milestones, while the child who chooses discipline, responsibility, and quiet service is treated like an embarrassing necessity. You start minimizing your accomplishments. You start hiding your strength because you don't want to disrupt the delicate, fragile egos of people who confuse wealth with character. But validation earned through performance is an empty currency. It depreciates the moment you stop being useful to their narrative. Mature people respect conduct. Insecure people only respect appearance. And when the storm finally arrives, and it always arrives, the performative life collapses under the weight of its own illusions, while the steady, disciplined life remains standing. Stop shrinking yourself to keep insecure relatives comfortable. Stop explaining your value to people who only look at the quality of your jacket instead of the character of the person wearing it. Real power doesn't need to shout. It doesn't need a VIP seat at a Greenwich table. It simply waits for the truth to clear the room. My mother spent 30 years trying to teach me that success has a specific look, that it looks like cashmere, billionaire in-laws, and country club dinners. But as I watched her alone in that ruined ballroom, surrounded by empty champagne bottles and federal warrants, I officially understood the deeper meaning of the lesson she had accidentally given me. A military necklace doesn't mean you belong to the state. It means you belong to a world where honor is a structure, not a decoration. If this story meant something to you, I hope you'll share it with someone who may need this reminder today. Hit that subscribe button, leave your thoughts in the comments below, and remember, your dignity survives privately, even when the room refuses to see it.